this assertion is correct? And if so, what is it that we are now targeting, if not al-Qaeda? That's a fundamental question that came up in the hearings with Secretary of State then Clinton. When she came to the Senate, to the Foreign Relations Committee, they changed their tune and said, no, it was core al-Qaeda, not just al-Qaeda, but core al-Qaeda, and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But fundamentally, the tune has changed. Senator Paul goes on, is the U.S. drone strike strategy exclusively focused on targeting al-Qaeda, or is it also conducting counterinsurgency operations against militants seeking to further undermine their government, such as in Yemen? Would you support expansion, he says, of the CIA's drone program in Mali to provide support to counterterrorism operations? And we all know what happened there and the impact in Benghazi and the concern that those that weren't captured or tried in Benghazi for the atrocities there went then to Mali. So, again, a key question. The senator goes on, do you believe a long-term sustained drone strike program can eliminate all threats to the American people, or completely eliminate al-Qaeda, as you have indicated in your intent? If not, how would we eventually wind down the drone program? At what point do you believe drone strikes will reach the point of diminishing returns? If so, can it be done on the scale the drone program operates on now, or would it have to be expanded? Question. And I was going to specifically ask Senator Paul to discuss this. Do you support the Attorney General's 2012 guidance to the NCTC that it may deliberately collect, store, and continually assess massive amounts of data on all U.S. citizens for potential correlations to terrorism, even if the U.S. citizens targeted have no known ties to terrorism? Which gets into the whole thing that we started on earlier today. What role does the government play? Where is the role of individual freedoms, right to trial, right to be heard, right to present their case? What about the fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights? I would just, I think the final question here to Mr. Brennan is, please describe in detail the steps you have taken as assistant to the President, as well as transparency measures you would support as Director of the CIA to improve the transparency of the administration's counterterrorism policies. Mr. President, I would just say extremely well thought out questions by a very thoughtful senator, and questions that the American people would like to have answers to. There is more to the letter. But I would just like to take a second to ask from Senator Paul if he feels that those have been adequately addressed, and if he feels he's gotten closer to the solution to the question of, do you believe the President has the power to authorize lethal force, such as a drone strike, against a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil and without trial? And that would be my question to you, Senator Paul.
Mr. President, we've sent 3 different letters over the last month and a half or so, and we really have not gotten a detailed response to any of the letters. We finally had one question answered from John Brennan, and that question was answered by him by saying that the CIA doesn't operate within the United States, which is a reassertion of the law, which we at least appreciated, but they have responded by saying they will follow the law. We haven't gotten an adequate answer, I think, yet, although we're getting closer to it, and maybe the senator from Texas can give us a little more insight into this, in the sense that the question now really isn't just Brennan. Brennan has answered that the CIA can't operate in the United States, but there's a question, can the military operate in the United States? And this question was asked, I think, very poignantly by the senator from Texas today, trying to get an answer from the Attorney General on this question: can you kill Americans in American soil who are not involved in combat? And the answer has been evasive, because he's brought up basically a red herring, you know, Pearl Harbor or the Twin Towers, which none of us are disputing that the military can respond to a lethal attack with lethal force. So what I'd like to do, without relinquishing the floor, is to see if the senator from Texas would like to respond to his interpretation of what he was hearing from Attorney General Holder, and whether the comments he was hearing, if Attorney General Holder were willing to sort of try to complete that conversation in a letter to us, whether actually we might get close to actually being on the same page.
I thank the senator from Kentucky for allowing me to ask him a series of questions. and to address both what the Attorney General said and the substantive issue. I want to begin my questioning, though, by simply an observation, and I want to take a moment to thank the senator from Kentucky. I have had the privilege of serving in this body 9 weeks, and today is the first day I have ever had the extraordinary privilege of speaking on the floor of the Senate. And on my first time to speak in the floor of the Senate, I found myself being given the chance to read from Travis's letter from the Alamo. As I observed walking off the floor of the Senate, as they say in the beer commercial, it don't get no better than this. So I thank the senator from Kentucky for giving me the opportunity to be welcomed to the floor of the Senate and having a chance to stand with him fighting for liberty. Now, there are a number of things I'd like to address and ask the senator from Kentucky's views on. I'll begin by observing, as I did the last time the senator from Kentucky and I had a colloquy, that Twitter never sleeps. And we heard from a number of tweets across the country, but those have not ceased. And so, since the senator from Kentucky is still prohibited from looking at his cell phone, I wanted to prevent him from going into technology shock and withdrawal and provide an in-person Twitter feed for you. This is about the Constitution. Stand with Rand. Get it together, GOP. Stand with Rand. Rand praising Dem Oregon Senator Ron Wyden for raising the same questions and concerns he has. Where are all the other Dems? Sad day when killing Americans is up for debate. Sad that every senator is not up there with him. Stand with Rand. We are watching you guys. I don't know how Senator Rand Paul does it. I'm tired just from watching him. A tip of the cap to you, sir. Thank you. Stand with Rand. Senator Rand Paul is extemporaneously giving a better human rights speech than Barack Obama ever has. Stand with Rand. And I'm pretty certain, for the record, I can confirm that no teleprompter was in front of the senator from Kentucky's desk. Senator Rand Paul, Jimmy Stewart would be proud, sir. Senator Rand Paul, look what's trending. Stand with Rand. It's been a while since I could say I am a proud American. Thank you, Rand Paul. Stand with Rand. Rand Paul might be waiting a long time for an answer from the White House. Stand with Rand. I would note it has been 10 hours, so that would indeed be a correct observation of fact. At Democrats, why not just agree that the POTUS cannot use drones to summarily kill U.S. citizens on U.S. soil? Stand with Rand. Senator Rand Paul crosses 8-hour threshold of filibuster. Stand with Rand. Stand with Rand, please. Senator Rand Paul did not filibuster for the right or the left. He did it for every person in this country. Stand with Rand. Once you give up your rights, you will not get them back. Believe that. Stand with Rand. We should all go to the U.S. Capitol and stand with Rand. And I would note that quite a few members of the House of Representatives have crossed over the Capitol and joined us precisely to stand with Rand, as have the men and women in the gallery who have been here throughout this long and historic stand. Finally able to sit and watch the Rand Paul filibuster. Just epic. Stand with Rand. Read the Constitution and explain why each sentence is relevant to today. Not worthless and outdated. 7 hours and counting for Senator Rand Paul in the filibuster. This can end, Brennan. Just say you won't unilaterally kill us. Stand with Rand. America is watching. Stand with Rand. I get the feeling that a more libertarian stance is the only thing which can bring about a fresh start for the GOP. Stand with Rand. I stand with Rand in his 9th hour, awaiting the president saying he doesn't have the power to kill Americans at will. Quote, I haven't killed anyone yet, and I have no intention of killing Americans, but I might. End quote, President Barack Obama. Stand with Rand. The federal government was closed today, yet Senator Rand Paul was working overtime. You demand, and that would be D-A-M-A-N is the precise spelling of that. Senator Rand Paul, 100% supports you. Keep going. Stand with Rand. This isn't a filibuster. This is a line in the sand drawn with a quill pen that penned the Constitution. I think that one's particularly cool. Do you agree with your colleague, Representative Justin Amash? Stand with Rand. Almost always the answer to that one should be yes. Do you stand with Senator Rand Paul and demand an answer from the White House on extrajudicial assassinations of Americans? There's a word we don't hear too often within our own borders, assassinations. And yet that's exactly what we're talking about here tonight. Don't think I've ever been quite so proud to say I'm from Kentucky. Stand with Rand. Senator Rand Paul getting to the heart of issues. Not partisan politics, but a question of due process. He's just about 8 hours away from having the 5th longest filibuster. I apologize to the senator from Kentucky if that is less than encouraging. Stand with Rand. I have a renewed sense of hope for our leaders in Washington today. Thank you, Senator Rand Paul, for standing by we the people. Stand with Rand. I am a strong liberal supporter and 2-time Obama voter. I stand with Rand. Dr. Rand Paul, excellent, excellent work today. We stand with Rand too. I hope Senator Rand Paul can keep them up all night. There hasn't been a real filibuster on the Senate floor in years. Stand with Rand. And I would note, as I was walking in, that this is certainly the least well-shaven I have been on the Senate floor. And it is particularly ironic that the desk I am sitting at, in addition to having been the former desk of a great hero of mine, Senator Barry Goldwater, was also the former desk of Senator Richard Nixon, and so perhaps that spirit is animating the 5 o'clock shadow that I find myself at 10 o'clock at night sporting. Stand with you, I do. Stand with Rand. I wonder if that one was from Dr. Seuss. Stand with Rand because you have the freedom to do so. Obama is going to have to address the points raised by Paul. I stand with Rand. Best line of the filiblizzard thus far. Retweet yet another of Senator Rand Paul's miraculous tweets that he did from the floor of the Senate. A tweet of Senator Rand Paul, quote, "They shouldn't just drop a Hellfire missile on your cafe experience." I would suggest to the senator from Kentucky that at the end of what I am sure will be a long and very distinguished career in politics, fighting for every American, that with statements like that, a subsequent career at Starbucks may indeed be promising. The fight for liberty has a real hero. May the spirits of past patriots fuel you. Until you get an answer, Rand, keep on going. Let's take it into tomorrow. Is suspicion enough? Obviously not. Senator Rand Paul. If you have family or friends in the Middle East, you might be a terrorist. Stand with Rand. For the first time since November, I feel like I see a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a long tunnel. Stand with Rand. Senator Rand Paul, quote, "If you have no bounds, you have an unlimited imperial presidency." So true. Senator Rand Paul, 8 hours and still going strong. Thank you for standing for the Constitution. God bless you. Stand with Rand. Thank you, Rand Paul, for standing up for our Constitution. We are behind you. Stand with Rand. Go get 'em, Rand Paul. Great way to end my birthday. Stand with Rand. I hope we do not make it to that individual's next birthday. Best TV I've seen in a while. Stand with Rand. Senator Rand Paul, I'm super proud of my senator today. I've always been proud of him, but today I'm more proud than ever. Stand with Rand, written in all caps. My kids watching Rand Paul give a lesson to the country on their own without me telling them to. Stand with Rand. Thank you, Senator Rand Paul. Why won't Obama say that he won't use drones to kill non-combatant U.S. citizens on U.S. soil? Seems a simple question. Stand with Rand. Senator Rand Paul, thank you. Be encouraged and stay strong. Would stand there with you if we could. We're no longer free. Thank you for standing up for freedom. Stand with Rand is trending worldwide. That's pretty darn cool. Rand Paul goes into his 9th hour of filibuster over drones. Watch it here, and I won't read the link to C-SPAN. Senator Rand Paul, I'm so proud of you. Way to stand tall. Stand with Rand. Senator Rand Paul, your loyalty and dedication to we the people are not going unnoticed. Stand with Rand. If you give back your rights, don't ever expect them to get them back. Stand with Rand. Call the White House, 202-456-1111. Take a stand. You know, for some reason I feel compelled to read that tweet a second time. Call the White House, 202-456-1111. Rand Paul, standing for liberty and freedom, God bless you. Stand with Rand. Rand Paul, the 21st century version of Washington, Jefferson, and Madison. No matter how you fall politically, you have to admire Rand Paul's absolute conviction. I can't stop watching Senator Rand Paul filibuster. Greatness. Stand with Rand. Are you going to retweet Stand with Rand all night? I am. Liberty. Rand Paul. And the final one, Senator Rand Paul, I'm a grandma who just learned how to Twitter tonight so that I could stand with Rand and the Constitution. Now, the first question I will ask of the senator from Kentucky, and I have several more, is simply, what would you say to these millions of Americans and people worldwide who are coming together to stand with Rand?
Mr. President, I thank the senator from Texas for coming to the floor, and I'm overwhelmed with all of the responses. What I would say is that I think there are things that are more important than personalities, more important than party, and they're the things that our country's founded upon. And I mean, these are the things that I think bring people together who really want us to stand up and say that these protections will exist. The interesting thing about our Constitution is it protects people who are those who are defenseless often. Those who can be falsely accused of crimes are what the Constitution is there for. So I think there are people from all walks of life who say, you know, my brother was falsely accused, or my brother was put in jail for 5 years or something for something either they didn't do or it was an inappropriate sentence. I think people understand the idea of wanting to be protected from false accusation, not only for something where you might be put in prison, but for something in this case you might be killed for. And that we all understand, I mean, all you got to do is get online to read comments to any kind of story online to know that people make all kinds of wild accusations and wild comments online. Do we really want to be that is one of the indications for whether or not you might be targeted for surveillance or whether you might be targeted for a drone strike? That anything like this could happen really without you having your due process, that the Fifth Amendment somehow would be optional, that the executive branch would decide when they're going to apply the Fifth Amendment. So I'm overwhelmed with the responses, and I think it is something that unifies people, and it's brought together people both from the Democrat side of the aisle as well as the Republican side of the aisle, because to me this isn't about whether the president is Republican or Democrat. I've supported several of his nominees. I've supported people because I think he has the right to make political nominations, even though I don't agree with a lot of, or really much of any of the nominees or the politics of the administration. This is different. This is a constitutional principle. We're here today to filibuster against or for a constitutional principle, not necessarily an individual. But it's something that, you know, I think a lot of Americans believe strongly, and I thank very much, Mr. President, the comments that I've gotten from the senator. Would they entertain any other questions?
I thank the senator from Kentucky, and I do indeed have additional questions. You know, the heart of what you're standing for, what so many other senators tonight are standing for, is liberty. And that, I think, has always been the foundational value in the United States of America. Our country was founded by framers who understood that concentrated power is always inimical to liberty. That any time great power is undivided, that the freedom of the people is at jeopardy. As Lord Acton observed, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is for that reason that the framers of our Constitution did what the Supreme Court has described as splitting the atom of sovereignty, taking what used to be one discrete, indivisible concept of power and sovereignty and breaking it up between the three branches of the federal government and breaking it up between the federal government and the 50 states and the local governments as well. And the purpose of doing all of that is to prevent what James Madison in Federalist Number 10 described as factions. Today we would call them special interests that might take control of one branch of government. If all power were concentrated in the executive, and one faction, one special interest were to gain influence in that executive, then the liberty of the people would be at peril. And in Federalist 10, Madison explained that factions are never going to go away. Human nature is such that we will divide into factions with different interests, and the genius of the framers was not to imagine human nature was somehow different than it was, but to recognize that it was. As the Federalist Papers explained, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. The great challenge in forming a government is to enable the government to do what it must, and yet at the same time oblige it to govern itself. And for that reason, splitting the atom of sovereignty, separating power, prevents any one branch of government from acquiring unchecked power. It is indeed the responsibility of this body to do what we're doing now. If a president of the United States decrees the power to take the lives of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil without due process of law, I would suggest it is integral to the oath of office of every member of the United States Senate and every member of the United States House of Representatives to stand up and say, Mr. President, respectfully, no, you may not. The Constitution gives you no such power, and each of us on entering office, in my case, just a few weeks ago, standing on those steps, the Vice President asked me to raise my hand and take an oath to honor and defend the Constitution. Every member of this body took that oath, and it is our responsibility, especially when one branch of the government is overreaching, is usurping power that the Constitution forbids him and that is threatening to the liberty of the people. It is the responsibility of all of us to stand up and resist that. You know, one of my all-time heroes, Ayn Rand, in Atlas Shrugged, described how the parasitical class would put into place arbitrary power. Standardless rules, precisely so the productive citizens in the private sector would have to come on bended knee to those in government seeking special dispensation, seeking special favor. Because that arbitrary and standardless rule empowers the political class and disempowers the people. I couldn't help but think about Ayn Rand's observations this morning as I heard the Attorney General over and over and over again refuse to say it would be unconstitutional for the federal government to kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil. Now, he would say it would be inappropriate. He said that 3 times in response to direct questioning. It would be inappropriate, and we should trust him. The federal government would not do so. And I found myself thinking of those arbitrary standards Ayn Rand talked about. That if the only protection we the people have against the federal government choosing to take the life of a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil is our trust that they would refrain from doing what is inappropriate, rather than the protections of the Constitution, then I would suggest our liberty is fragile indeed. Indeed, when you think about the concentration of power, no judicial opinion is more important than Justice Robert Jackson's concurring opinion in the Youngstown steel seizure case. Now, Justice Jackson, as the senator from Kentucky knows, was a giant on the U.S. Supreme Court. My former boss, Chief Justice William Rehnquist, served as a law clerk to Justice Robert Jackson. And indeed, Justice Jackson took time off from serving on the U.S. Supreme Court to serve as the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, during which he made the powerful observation following World War II when the United States brought to trial the horrific war criminals in the Nazi regime. Justice Jackson observed at Nuremberg that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law, is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. I would suggest to the senator from Kentucky, and I feel confident he would agree, that what we are talking about right now is the tribute that power must and should pay to reason, and that unchecked power is always a threat to liberty. Now, as Justice Jackson opined in Youngstown steel seizure, that comprehensive and undefined presidential powers hold both practical advantages and grave dangers for the country, will impress anyone who has served as a legal advisor to a president in a time of transition and public anxiety. Those words could have been written as easily tonight as they were half a century ago. Justice Jackson continued, while the Constitution diffuses power to better secure liberty, it also contemplates that practice will integrate the dispersed power into a workable government. It enjoins upon its branches separateness but interdependence, autonomy but reciprocity. Presidential powers are not fixed but fluctuate, depending on their disjunction or conjunction with those of Congress. When a president acts pursuant to an express or implied authorization of Congress, his authority is at its maximum. I think there can be no disputing that any claim of presidential authority to kill U.S. citizens on U.S. soil in absence of an imminent threat has no express or implied authorization of Congress, and that presidential authority is wanting. Number two, Justice Jackson explains, when the president acts in the absence of either a congressional grant or denial of authority, he can only rely upon his own independent powers. But there is a zone of twilight in which he and Congress may have concurrent authority, or in which the distribution is uncertain. Therefore, congressional inertia, indifference, or quiescence may sometimes, at least as a practical matter, enable, if not invite, measures on independent presidential responsibility. In this area, any actual test of power is likely to depend upon the imperatives of the events and contemporary imponderables rather than on abstract theories of law. Now, perhaps prior to 11:45 today, Attorney General Eric Holder and John Brennan would have argued they fall into this second category, a category where Congress has been silent, and accordingly, they might presume some presidential power. But as of 11:45 today, they can no longer claim that. Justice Jackson explained the third category of presidential powers. When the president takes measures incompatible with the express or implied will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb. For then he can rely only upon his own constitutional powers minus any constitutional powers of Congress over the matter. Courts can sustain exclusive presidential control in such a case only by disabling the Congress from acting on the subject. Presidential claim to a power at once so conclusive and preclusive must be scrutinized with caution. For what is at stake is the equilibrium established by our constitutional system. You know, as we stand here tonight, later than the typical hour for the Senate being in session, indeed later than many members of this body had anticipated being in Washington, D.C., many members of this body had envisioned being on planes and returning home by now. But it occurs to me that those senators who have heeded the encouragement of the Twitterverse to stand with Rand, those senators who have come here today, I am reminded of Henry V. As Shakespeare observed, "What's he that wishes so, my cousin Westmoreland? No, fair cousin. If we are marked to die, we are enow to do our country's loss. And if to live the fewer men, the greater share of honor, God's will I play thee, wish not one man more. By Jove, I am not covetous for gold, nor care I who doth feed upon my cost. It yearns me not if men my garments wear. Such outward things dwell not in my desires. But if it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive. No faith, my cause, wish not a man from England. God's peace, I would not lose so great an honor, as one man more methinks would share from me. For the best hope I have oh, do not wish one more. Rather proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and crowns for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian. Then he will strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispian's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names familiar in his mouth as household words. Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, when we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed that they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. I would observe to the Senator of Kentucky that those glorious sentiments expressed centuries ago are precisely applicable to the stand here tonight, because it is a stand against high odds. Indeed, it is a stand against an administration that refuses to acknowledge limits on its power. And it is a stand for the same purpose, for liberty. There is a frustration across this country, a frustration not with Democrats or Republicans, not with one party or the other, a frustration with entrenched politicians in Washington who don't seem to work for anybody. I'm convinced there's something incredible happening in this country, that the people are standing up and reminding the men and women of this body that every one of us works for we the people. And it is our principal task to stand and defend liberty, especially when liberty is threatened. Indeed, that St. Crispian's Day speech had a same, and even in some ways a different manifestation in one of the greatest movies of all time, Patton. The opening scene of Patton, I will confess to the Senator of Kentucky, I have more than once, in preparation for an oral argument in court, simply watched George C. Scott marching out in front of a flag the size of North Dakota. Standing in front of the flag, General Patton observed in a tribute to that very same speech I just read, and I'm going to modify it slightly to make it PG. Men, I want you to remember that no fellow ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor fellow die for his country. Men, all this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Americans traditionally love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle. When you were kids, you all admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, big league ball players, the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war, because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. George C. Scott continued his patent. There's another thing I want you to remember. I don't want to get any messages saying we are holding our position. We're not holding anything. Let the other side do that. We're advancing constantly. We're not interested in holding on to anything except the enemy. We're going to hold him by the nose and kick him in the posterior. We're going to kick the heck out of him all the time. We're going to go through him like through a goose. 30 years from now, when you're sitting around the fireside with your grandson on your knee, and he asks you, "What did you do in the Great World War II?" You won't have to say, "Well, I shoveled manure in Louisiana." That same sentiment, the same sentiments in St. Crispin Day, talked about a tradition that has been a tradition in America for centuries, of men and women rallying together to fight for freedom, rallying against hard odds, rallying against challenging obstacles. And I would observe that that fight should not be a partisan fight. This is not a question of Republican or Democrat. Liberty, the right to life of every American citizen from arbitrary taking at the hands of the federal government, should not simply be a value that one side or another of this chamber embraces. Indeed, I would note, during the hearings this morning with Attorney General Eric Holder, some of the most enthusiastic audience participants in that hearing were self-identified members of Code Pink, who I would suggest are not ordinarily individuals who would be described as card-carrying members of the Republican Party. But liberty does not have a partisan affiliation. Indeed, to the senator from Kentucky, I think it is an interesting question what the reaction in this chamber and outside would be if the very same statements that have been made were made by a president who happened to be Republican. I think there is little doubt that the outcry would be deafening, and rightly so. And I will say to the senator from Kentucky, if a president made the identical representations and happened to have an R behind his or her name, I have not one shadow of a doubt that the senator from Kentucky would be standing here 10 hours in, protesting the arbitrary assertion of power by a president, regardless of whether we share his party or not. Indeed, I would note to the senator from Kentucky, this is a scenario which is not entirely hypothetical. Prior to serving in this body, I had the great privilege of serving my home state of Texas as the Solicitor General of Texas. And during that time, we faced a tragic and epic battle in a case called Medellin versus Texas. Medellin began with a crime that really shocked the conscience. 2 little girls were horrifically abused and murdered by a gang in Houston. They were apprehended, they confessed, and they were convicted by a jury of their peers, quite rightly. At that point, the case took a very, very strange turn, because the World Court, which is the judicial arm of the United Nations, issued an order to the United States to reopen the convictions of 51 murderers across this country, including one of the murderers in this case, Jose Ernesto Medellin. Now, I will tell you, Jose Medellin wrote a 4-page handwritten confession in that case. It's one of the most chilling documents I've ever had the displeasure of reading. In it, he bragged about hearing those little girls beg for their lives. A tiny detail he included in those letters was in many ways the most haunting, and I know it will remain with me for the rest of my life. He described how the youngest of those girls was wearing a Mickey Mouse watch, and how he kept it as a trophy of that night because he was so proud of the atrocities they had committed. It was truly sickening what those young boys did that evening. And yet, the World Court asserted a power that heretofore has never been asserted. It was the first time in history a foreign court has ever tried to bind the U.S. justice system. The World Court claimed the authority to reopen those convictions, and so Texas stood up and fought the World Court. I had the honor of arguing this case twice in front of the United States Supreme Court. On the other side, we had 90 foreign nations that came in against the state of Texas. 90 nations came in and argued that the United States justice system should be completely subject to the authority of the World Court and the United Nations. And also on the other side, most disturbingly, was the President of the United States. The President signed a 2-paragraph order that attempted to order the state courts to obey the World Court. Again, that order, like the World Court's order, was unprecedented. It was the first time in history any president has ever attempted to order the state courts to do anything. Unfortunately, the president at issue in that case was a Republican. It was President George W. Bush, a man for whom I worked, a man who in many respects I respect. And yet, in that case, he asserted a power that could be found nowhere in the Constitution. And in consultation with my boss at the time, Attorney General Greg Abbott, I went before the United States Supreme Court and argued on behalf of the state of Texas that the President of the United States has no authority to give away U.S. sovereignty. Now, that was done notwithstanding the fact that the President was a Republican, notwithstanding the fact that the President was the former governor of my home state of Texas. Because at the end of the day, defending liberty, defending sovereignty, defending the Constitution is not a partisan choice. It's not a game of dodgeball with shirts and skins, that if your team happens to have the ball, you all stick together. Every one of us has taken an oath of office, and we have an obligation to stand up. And so I stood before the U.S. Supreme Court representing the state of Texas, arguing that no president of the United States, be he Republican or Democrat, has the authority to give up U.S. sovereignty and make the state courts subject to the World Court. Now, I would note in that case, the state of Texas had support from a number of unlikely sources. Indeed, we had a wide range of amici, of friends of the court, who came in and supported us. One brief was filed on behalf of law professors. It was joined by several law professors, one of whom, John Yoo, is widely considered the law professor with the most expansive view of presidential authority, and indeed was an individual who served in the Justice Department and had advocated under President Bush an expansive view of presidential authority. That very same brief was joined by Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean of the University of California at Irvine School of Law. Dean Chemerinsky is a very well-known and proud liberal academic. I suspect it may well be right that this is the only time ever that John Yoo and Erwin Chemerinsky joined a single brief before the U.S. Supreme Court. And both of them agreed, despite the fact that they come from very, very different places in the legal academy. Both of them agreed that unchecked power in the hand of the executive is fundamentally a threat to liberty. And indeed, I would note to the senator from Kentucky that in talking with both of them and in asking for their support in Medellin, I made the point to each, imagining a president from the other side who might have the power that was being asserted. To the friends of mine on the right, I suggested that if a president had the power to set aside state laws on grounds of international comity, which was the basis that was being asserted in that case, without any sanction from Congress, without any sanction from another branch of the federal government, simply on his own unilateral authority. To my friends on the right, I suggested that an activist president on the left could use that power to assert, for example, that in his or her judgment, the marriage laws of all 50 states should be set aside. Now, it may well be that all 50 states will choose to set their marriage laws aside. That is a judgment right now that has been in the hands of the voters in each state. But regardless of what the 50 states decided, I suspect they will not decide the same thing. It seems to me clear that no president has the authority unilaterally, with the flick of a finger, to remove laws from the state books of all 50 states. Likewise, to my friends on the left, I asked them to envision their nightmare of a right-wing president. They each had slightly different incarnations, but they all managed to do that. And I said, if this assertion of power is correct, that any president can set aside any state law if he or she deems it inconsistent with international comity, even though no treaty requires this, and indeed in Medellin, the Justice Department made clear no treaty required this. This was simply a power that was being asserted to further comity, to further our relationships with foreign nations. To my friends on my left, I suggested if the president has this power, what is to stop a president on the right from saying, I am setting aside the punitive damages laws in all 50 states? It upsets comity when companies, foreign companies, are subject to punitive damages award. Therefore, tort reform shall be the law in all 50 states. And for that matter, there are states like California that persist in putting in place incredibly restrictive environmental laws. If the president has the authority to flick aside state laws, what would prevent a president on the right from saying those environmental laws are no more? Now, I would note to the senator from Kentucky that my view on all of those questions was very clear and very straightforward. No president may do so, whether he or she is of the right or of the left. If the federal government is to set aside a state law, it may do so only through exercise of the Supremacy Clause. And the framers required that in order to set aside a state law that had been adopted by the democratically elected legislature in the state, that two branches had to work together in concert, either through legislation that passes the House of Representatives, passes the United States Senate, and is signed into law by the president, or through the form of a treaty that is signed by the president and ratified by 2/3 of the United States Senate. But in both instances, the framers required two branches to work together. Why? Because of the same reason we discussed before. The reason from Federalist 10 that you do not want power unified in one branch of government where a faction, a special interest, may seize control of it. You want it divided. Now, I will note it was an unusual position for the state of Texas to appear before the United States Supreme Court and argue that an action by a Republican president and former governor of the state of Texas was unconstitutional. And yet I can tell you I was very proud to have the opportunity to do just that. And I was even more proud when the Supreme Court of the United States ruled by a vote of 6-3 in favor of the state of Texas, concluding, number one, that the World Court has no authority whatsoever to bind the United States justice system, and number two, that the President has no authority under the Constitution to give away our sovereignty. I would suggest that's the way our system's supposed to work, that all of us, regardless of party, should be standing together for liberty. And when I think of standing for liberty, some of the frustration that people have across this country is they feel it doesn't do any good. Doesn't make a difference who they vote for, whoever they vote for. They go to Washington, they keep spending money, and they spend more money and more money and more money, and the debt goes up and up and up and up, and the federal laws get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the federal regulations get more and more and more and more, and nothing seems to change. And I understand that frustration. It is a real frustration. It is a frustration I share, and I know it is a frustration the senator from Kentucky shares. And I would suggest that tonight, part of the import of tonight is that the senator from Kentucky is standing with millions of Americans who are frustrated by politicians in Washington who are unwilling to rock the boat, who are unwilling to stand for change. And I'm reminded that change can sometimes seem hopeless. Indeed, I mentioned that the desk I'm standing at was previously occupied by Barry Goldwater. I have yet to acquire, but I intend to acquire, a leather-bound copy of Conscience of a Conservative, which I intend to keep in this desk. When Barry Goldwater became a national leader, his views were thought impossible to receive a wide audience. The views instead that were in the ascendancy were the views of the left, that government control of the economy of our lives was the proper and right direction for our nation. And yet I'm reminded of someone else, like the senator from Kentucky, who gave a speech on October 27th, 1964. He said the following: I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course. I believe that the issues confronting us cross party lines. Now, one side in this campaign, the campaign in 1964 for president, has been telling us that the issues of this election are the maintenance of peace and prosperity. The line has been used, we've never had it so good. But I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. Those were the days. And yet our government continues to spend $17 million a day more than the government takes in. Would that we could say today the government spends only $17 million a day more than it takes in. We haven't balanced our budget in 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. I will remind you this speech was given in 1964, not last week. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations of the world. We have $15 billion in gold in our treasury. We don't own an ounce. Foreign dollar claims are $27.3 billion. And we have just announced that the dollar of 1939 will now purchase 45 cents of its total value. Again, a scenario with which we are quite familiar. As for the peace that we would preserve, I wonder who among us would like to approach the wife or mother whose husband or son has died in South Vietnam and ask them if they think this is a peace that should be maintained indefinitely. Do they mean peace, or do they mean that we just want to be left in peace? There can be no real peace while one American is dying someplace in the world for the rest of us.